And we're joined now for some analysis by William Green. He is seated next to Lenny McAllister. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having us, Chris.
All right, and Clifford Levine is here also, seated next to me. Thank you for being here, gentlemen. We appreciate it. All right, let's get 30 seconds, starting with you, Bill, to your reaction to the State of the Union.
I didn't think it was all that exciting. I thought it was rather boring, and I think for the president it's probably a good thing. I looked at last year's speech and then read the transcript late last night once it was released, and there isn't a lot of difference from last year to this year. In fact, some of the same things he said 5 years ago were in this, particularly on Gitmo and closing that. He said he was going to do that right after he was elected. He didn't, and he pulled back from trying to do it. So there have been some things he said that haven't gotten through, even though he's pushed them time and time again. The minimum wage, I thought, was a good idea, and for the first time he actually said, you know, I'm encouraging employers to do it as opposed to do it by mandate, which I think is probably a very wise way to do it, because I don't think it's going to get passed through Congress anyway. And he touched very lightly on foreign policy. You know, a year ago he said, if you cross this red line, in August of 2012, he said, you cross this red line, there's going to be a whole different case of things with the Syrians, and they did more than cross the line with using chemical weapons on their own people, and yet we haven't done anything except deferred this to the Russians to negotiate. So I think domestically he hit a few singles out there, but there were no home runs, no doubles. I just, looking at Gallup, this is Gallup this morning, the president's approval is at 41%. So he needs a quick turnaround of about 10 points to get him in the positive side.
All right, let's go to Clifford Levine. You worked with the president's local steering committee in Western Pennsylvania. What did you think of the president's address?
Well, I thought it was a good speech, and I thought it addressed a certain reality of where he is with Congress. I mean, I don't think we can get around his experience over the last 5 years in terms of proposing certain plans, and I think what Bill says is correct. He recognizes that certain maybe larger scale plans or more ambitious plans aren't going to get through. So I think that there's an effort to, number one, try to take the lead, some of which through executive actions, but also to try to play to the state governments and local governments more in terms of some of these actions. So you're seeing how a change can take place in the country at a state level that often influences the federal. And then finally, I would just note that the one area he did leave open, that he wasn't saying we're going to do executive action, was with immigration, because it's become in the interest of the Republicans to see that something gets done. So that's really, I think, the primary focus on major legislation will be the immigration reform.
Lenny McAllister, your reaction?
I think that President Obama always does a good job of laying out a roadmap every January, but from February to December, he has a very hard time getting us on the highway and getting us down the road to a better America. And I think this is probably going to be another play of that. I look at things such as minimum wage, how he pushed that off to the states. I saw that as a political play. You push it off to states, particularly those that are having gubernatorial races this year, where the Republicans are basically controlling 2/3 of the gubernatorial mansions throughout the United States. It's a very smart political play to push that off, because he knows he's not going to be able to get that through Congress. When you look at something such as Gitmo, it's another play towards the Democratic base. This is something that's going to gin his base up for 2014. It's not necessarily something that's an agenda item that he really thinks he's going to be able to get accomplished in 2014. The thing that we needed to hear more of was not just income inequality, but how do you get people into the middle class, and how do you expand the middle class? And to continue to hear the same stale ideas with no progress, February through December was very hollow at best, and it's probably pretty demoralizing for Americans that are still sitting without unemployment benefits right now, or possibly looking at food stamp programs being cut by 1%, and are still struggling in an economy that he claimed is getting better with the unemployment rate going down, but people continue to fall out of the workforce.
Clifford, many of those programs that Lenny is talking about have been stopped, like unemployment benefits, by the Congress, by the Republicans.
Exactly. I mean, there's, you know, I think the most telling thing of that little segment you did was that the fact that the Republicans had 4 responses, not just one. There is no unified voice. Boehner is trying to get his own footing with his party. He lost control, obviously, with the shutdown. There's some talks that he's trying to get some control. There's battles with the Tea Party, with Rand, etc. So it's almost you're like dealing with somebody who there's nobody to deal with. I actually think Obama on occasion has tried to have the grand bargain in terms of Medicare, Social Security. I think he's willing to do that, really, even where the liberal base might not be happy with that.
The grand bargain?
Well, in terms of they talked about that with Social Security and Medicare and trying to deal with the entitlement
Yeah,
programs.
but he keeps changing the goalposts.
Well, where Boehner can't deliver. That's it.
Well, either way, but the fact is that Boehner gets a package together, he brings it to the president, all of a sudden the president says, no, I need more taxes.
We can agree to disagree on that. Bill, we can
no, you claim, sir, that is in fact what he has done, and he has not done it.
No, but that's, well, their side is that they've presented this, and Boehner has never been able, when he goes back to his caucus, he can't deliver it. I mean, we could talk about that forever.
Because it's not the same package.
Well,
once he takes it back, the president changes it.
One big example to that even goes to the budget that we just finally got passed here in January 2014. The House continued to pass budgets under John Boehner. It was the Senate that was unable to pass a budget for over 5 years, even when Democrats controlled the House of Representatives. So for this president to continuously look at Congress as the villain, it's a convenient political play. But when you look at the realities, there have been opportunities for this president to get stuff through Congress when he had control in 2009 and 2010. And there are other avenues where we can get people back to work that I know that moderate Republicans will work at.
Excuse me. He did get things through in 2009 and 2010.
He got Obamacare done.
Well, he did a lot. There was the stimulus. I mean, there was a lot.
And we made 10% in unemployment.
Well,
officially.
Well, wait. We had a
wait, one at a time.
Okay. All right. Listen. We had the worst recession. I mean, we had a great recession, the worst since the Depression. There was a meltdown that was occurring in September, and it was going on when he took office. We were in the midst of a plunge. I mean, I don't think you can dispute that. So those were the circumstances, and there was a lot that he was doing in terms of the stimulus. There was just a philosophy, good or bad. After 2010, there was a philosophy that was going to block any of these sort of larger programs. And a lot of it was premised on the deficit was big. Well, that was reflecting also the Great Recession. That's been significantly reduced. So I think there's just dramatic differences in viewpoint, I guess, so that's why you're going to have an effort to try to either do executive action or small ball, as they say. But I think on the immigration, the Republican Party is shooting itself in its foot year after year because it is alienating significant groups of the population. And so it's in their self-interest. And in politics, when it's in both of their self-interest, we might actually see a deal.
I think that there may be a deal there, but only if the president keeps his nose out of it, and he's been advised by the Senate on that. Well, you mentioned that he's passing on the increased minimum wage to the states. The states have nothing to do with it. They do not pass minimum wage laws. They can encourage, but it's the federal law that determines what minimum wage is.
They can definitely raise it within their own states, and we've seen states around the country do that. And then when you're talking about an issue that has populist appeal, that is something that can make a difference in some of the statewide races, which I think is why he shifted that to the states, because he knows at a federal level he's not going to be able to get that done.
Right.
But if he can encourage certain states and certain key states to do that, work for his party, not necessarily himself.
But they can only do that at state contracts. They can't do that to the local business guy. Okay, they can, as the president is doing on federal contracts. He's making a minimum wage for anybody that gets a federal contract. You can do that on a state contract, but you can't do it to the mom and pop store. I mean, that guy still has to abide by the federal law. Whether it should be increased, of course it should be increased. I think it should be, but there's a caveat to that, and this is something that Boehner said 2 months ago. We will increase the minimum wage if that cost of increasing that is reduced from other spending packages, and I think that's a pretty fair approach to it. So instead, whatever it takes to make up this difference and to extend this another 33 weeks or whatever it's going to be, that amount should be deducted from overall expenditures. That's the Republican side.
I will note one of the great paradoxes, or one of the great ironies, when there's a talk about adding some type of spending program, there's a demand that there be cuts in other programs. Yet when the Republicans talk about a tax cut in any way, it's really accompanied by a demand to cut some aspects of government. They're willing to have tax cuts without any other correlating cut, on the theory that, well, the economy will grow, supply side Ronald Reagan. And so, you know, you're just dealing with a very difficult Congress.
And the 80s actually proved that out. Maybe not in 82 or 83, but by the time we got to 86, 87, 88, that did prove that out. And we need people getting back to work. The bottom line is we continue to focus on income inequality. We continue to focus on raising the minimum wage. People need career jobs, not just minimum wage jobs. And we heard too often last night about raising that minimum wage and minimum wage jobs and struggling versus prosperity. And that's something that this president is more inclined to do when he gets on the campaign trail than lead from the White House.
Well, I disagree with the premise that you know, there's a We just had a recession. We're trying to get people in jobs. There have been significant cuts from the state or in the state and local government level, understandably. So I don't think, one is to raise the minimum wage, but there's other opportunities, and he's talking about job opportunities and linking employers and doing sorts of things. I just don't think that there's any stomach. I haven't seen the Republicans advocating any type of programming. Now, that may be the philosophy. We're not going to have any type of federal role in trying to encourage workforce, that we're just going to basically have a series of tax cuts, and that's going to sort of restore the economy. But I haven't heard any Republican plans, and I thought it was really noteworthy when the Congresswoman spoke in the rebuttal. There was not a specific plan. There was nothing. I mean, there was absolutely nothing. And that issue, the Republicans are complaining, but they're devoid of any plans that are going to get the economy, except for this endless, let's
well, it should be. Whoa. This is the president's job to do. It's the president's job to propose. It is the Congress's job to dispose. And this president has lacked leadership, or he would be soaring in polls. He would be giving everything he wanted if he decided to show some compromise here, Cliff. And he hasn't been doing that. He talks compromise but doesn't act compromise.
On what
and that's the difference.
What issue, Bill? Exactly.
Well, pick one. Health care for one. He didn't get one Republican vote in health care. He didn't get one vote on the stimulus package. I mean, if you're going to compromise, then compromise.
Well, see, and that's
the Democrat definition of compromise is Republicans compromise.
No.
And it has to be both sides.
If you remember the whole health care thing, he had Olivia Snow, and she was working. She had voted something through committee, and there was basically an edict. You're not going to support this plan, and that Mitch McConnell was to the whole strategy was to stay united and oppose the president. So there were a number of instances where he's reached out and he's tried to compromise, and he hasn't been able to get anywhere. So again, we can go back and forth and do talking head thing.
It depends on the definition of what compromise is.
All right, we'll define compromise later in the program, but there's some other issues that we want to cover, and we want to look at the war footing, Iran, and all the rest that the president had talked about, including gender inequality, and that might be something this panel is poorly equipped to debate. I have no idea since it's all male, but we're going to take it up anyway, and you can join the conversation. Our number is 412-333-PC. Stay with us. And welcome back. Our number is 412-333-PCNC. Bill Green and Lenny McAllister are here, and we're also talking to Clifford Levine. We're talking about the President's State of the Union message. The President and many of the headlines, Clifford, seem to say that the President is looking toward getting things done on his own through executive order rather than working with the Congress if they do not go along with the program. Do you think that that's a good idea, and will he be able to accomplish anything?
Well, I think there are executive orders that will have some impact on the federal government. It's certainly not the same as congressional legislation, and an executive order can be redone by the next president. So there's limits to that. I think it's a recognition of you're going to either go back and propose legislation in Congress and bang your head, or you kind of cajole and influence and move and try to move things in different ways. And I think the executive order is a piece.
But you say bang your head, and they say that he has not worked with them. He has not compromised in any way, shape, or form.
Well, I mean, I disagree with that. We just had, for instance, the Farm Bill just passed. So there have been instances. The budget deal just went through. So there have been instances where there have been compromise. I think that and again, I appreciate that different sides may have different views, and we can argue without influencing one another in that. But the fact is, I think from the Democratic point of view, on certain major issues, they're just going to hit a dead road with the House. We talked about minimum wage. You said, that might be a good idea, but it's just never going to go through. Well, how do you compromise with that?
Well, you compromise by cutting spending so that you can afford to increase the minimum wage. It's very simple.
This president has been very notoriously noted for not being able to work the room on Capitol Hill. I mean, this is something that comes from journalists. This comes from both sides of the aisle. And in order to get things done as president, you have to be able to schmooze people. You have to be able to work with all different types of folks within that Congress. He has not done that very effectively. And he's sitting there talking about executive orders now and doing it for the sake of the American people. Well, so far the types of orders he's done, even with his landmark legislation, has been for big business. He hasn't delayed anything for the average everyday American.
But that's what he's talking about now.
Well, do you see him doing anything to delay Obamacare and pushing the effects of that's hitting the everyday American hard?
He talks Obamacare. He had several people in the audience last night talking about talking about what benefits there were for pre-existing conditions and other kinds of instances.
But at the same time, when we're talking about the economic impacts, the types of things that he allowed big business to be able to avoid going through 2014, going through an election bid.
You're saying this president is for big business?
I'm saying this president has done a lot for big business. He continues to claim a recovery that we see on Wall Street, but this very Main Street that he campaigned to in 2008 continues to struggle. They still think we're in recession.
Observation, Clifford, that the Democrats are for big business. I thought it was that shoe was on the other foot.
Well, I think that President Obama has been a much more balanced and centrist president than people actually give him credit for. And I think as for this notion of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, you know, first of all, health care is an incredibly complex situation. And there might have been good political advice from Rahm Emanuel that you should avoid this issue entirely because it's hard, it's very difficult. And, you know, there are people who are going to be in a better situation. There are 40 million people, many working poor, many people working who just couldn't get health care, pre-existing illnesses, etc. So this act is addressing that. And, you know, you can pick out certain people whose plans were cut. You can pick out certain people like that woman last night who was able to afford the surgery that she needed and not go bankrupt. So I think we're in the process of starting this. I don't know that there's a way back at this point. I mean, this is what our healthcare system is, and I haven't heard a reasonable alternative being presented from the Republicans. And I think a good example of compromise would be if you're talking about improving certain aspects that won't go to undercut the plan. But
how much of this is driven by big business itself? We look at Obamacare, as it is often called, and many people talk about how the healthcare companies wrote the legislation. The reason that the mandate was there because they knew that they would reap a windfall from that. So how much of this is driven by big business and not the Congress being independent?
Well, let me offer what I think is a historical perspective. If you remember, President Clinton tried to do the health care, and a lot of the pharmaceutical companies and the insurance companies were involved in trying to defeat that. And so I think the idea was when he got into the White House, he met with a lot of those companies, and there was a choice. You could go through a single pay, which like something like Howard Dean.
The bidding of big pharma.
Well, it was again. There's a reality check. It's like if you're not going to do, you do single pay. The notion of these insurance exchanges wasn't just Governor Romney in Massachusetts. This was a conservative idea in terms of creating competition as distinct from having a single pay. So I think he started out in a sort of capitalist framework to try to do that, and that's what we're saying.
But so was insurance portability. This was something that actually President Obama brought up in September 2009 during the infamous Joe Wilson You Lie speech that Democrats said, never mind, Mr. President, we have this. We also talk about things such as tort reform that were also brought up by Republicans. Republicans did come to the table with health insurance and ideas, but we have to remember the environment at the time. Democrats had historic numbers in both the House of Representatives, and they created a supermajority in the Senate, and they were not going to waste that opportunity when it came to health care reform. And what we got was a Frankenstein law that has not worked for the American people by and large, and we still have a stagnant economy. And now you have two big problems that we're dealing with in 2014 rather than fixing one at a time.
So you say it hasn't worked. It's just being implemented right now. We're in the process of signing up.
There's a difference
But it's been a rough rollout.
Well, the rollout, I think, you know, look at the rollout didn't. I think the president would be the first to tell you, and he bears some responsibility for that rollout.
Some responsibility?
Well, he does. Well, I mean, yeah.
It's called Obamacare.
Yes. Well, no, but I'm saying the rollout didn't work. They went and they got a whole new team in. They've been, you know, furiously, they worked to get it. So the system, the website seems to be working now. But that, I think, if you're sitting here, the Republicans had just shut down Congress over the budget impasse. His numbers had increased. He just won the election.
But that's the window dressing. The window dressing to this decrepit House is the fact that for many, many Americans, the premiums are going up and they can no longer afford insurance. And they used to have plans that work for their families that are no longer available, and neither are their doctors anymore under this new law.
Listen, wait, excuse me. One question for both you guys, if I may.
Just very quickly, because we have to take a break.
Hillary Care was for people who could not get insurance. As I remember in '93, it was Hillary Care. It was for people who were uninsured, and we wanted to get them insured. Obamacare turns out to be universal. And I thought both of these are distantly from one or the other.
We'll have to pick that up when we come back. Stay with us.
I just don't understand how that changed.
Actually, I don't think
And welcome back. I'm Chris Moore. Our number is 412-333-PCNC. It's Pittsburgh Now. We're joined by Bill Green and Lenny McAllister. Also here with us is Clifford Levine. We're talking about the President's State of the Union address. You can join the conversation by dialing 412-333-PCNC. Bill, I hate to cut you off, but there was a hard break. Did you finish your point you wanted to make?
Well, I may be more off the air than on the air. But I was just saying that
it did get animated here during the break.
But 20 years ago, when Hillary Care was proposed, it was my remembrance that it was specifically targeted to those people who could not get insurance and were uninsured. And Obamacare was, in fact, much larger in scope, much more universal in scope, and consequently the difference in support and difference in cost. And I was just trying to get agreement if my memory was at all well served or not.
Any agreement on that?
No, there wasn't.
Okay, well, what about Romney Care? Was that any different?
Well, that was another sidebar, and that was that maybe this thing should have been best done by state, and I guess 17 states have done the exchanges, and they seem to be doing better than the
well, that's
the
what
main
I think
thing.
That's fascinating. If the state governor embraced the program, they'd be working a lot better than those that
Washington State, California, even Oregon,
Kentucky was the example.
Kentucky that he brought up last night. We'll see what's going in New York. That still seems to be in its embryonic stages, but it's such a huge state. So we'll see how those go. And then the states that didn't, the other 20 or 30 that didn't, are all in the massive exchange of the federal government. And we don't know what that's going to be until March 31 when we have the final figures.
It's an interesting point, because I think at the time of passing the bill, I think there was a thought that there'd be a battle, and then once it was passed, then we would move on, which often happens, the prescription drugs or whatever. And then once it happened, and I think what happened, if the governor of a particular state wasn't buying in, it means the exchange, but it also means going out and recruiting younger people, healthier people to participate.
And this is something that the Republicans have to remember in 2014 moving forward, that this bill, by and large, health care reform overall, was still supposed to be about increasing accessibility and bringing down the cost so that you can have more affordability. Now that you have this in place, what transpires with this Congress, what transpires with this president to keep those things in mind? Because right now we are seeing this law in place. People are still trying to understand it. We have all the maneuvers that are going on, but those two key things are not being focused on the way they need to. If this is going to be removed, or I would dare say not necessarily removed, but modified, it's going to have to make sure that those two things are back in place across the board.
Right. And I would say one of the inherent difficulties with Congress is it's a lot easier to have a tax cut than a program cut. I mean, I think that's just a truism. And so that plays out. For instance, Ted Cruz last night was talking about eliminating the medical devices tax, which helps pay for this without any of the related, what I was saying, without saying, well, how are we going to...
All this stuff gets so complicated. Wouldn't it have been easier if the president had said Medicare for all and just expanded that program single payer?
Well, that one, Howard Dean, that's when, like Howard Dean and others had advocated that. And a huge component of this plan was the expansion of Medicare to the 55, to others, and that's what the Supreme Court reversed. So
Bill,
that was a big hole.
Bill, when we first debated this issue, you once told me that you thought that this would become another third rail of politics, that once it's implemented, whether and if it started to work one way or the other, that politicians wouldn't be able to touch it. Do you still stand by that assessment?
Yeah, I do, but with this caveat, if this thing gets done. I also said that I thought the weight of the federal bureaucracy and the infrastructure and all the complications, that it's going to fall by its own weight, by its own bureaucratic weight and expense. But if they manage to get over all of that, and I still have huge question marks about this, then it will be a third rail and won't be able to be touched. But until we see whether we've got these 7 million people signed up by 3/31/14,
you don't think that's going to happen, do you?
No, and the numbers just don't show. We're supposed to be getting 39,000 a day registered, 39,000 a day registered to make their goal, and they're not doing it.
You don't think it's going to happen?
What are they, about halfway? They're about 3.5 million.
They're down 3.5 million.
Yeah, and they might not. Yeah,
on their own. This is their own goal.
And yeah, and it is a complicated. There's like backups in terms of risk corridors, which they call for. It gets very complicated, but I think it's going to go. I don't think there's. It's hard to imagine. You know, you can't just repeal it like the Congress is trying to do, because you're kind of left with nothing then. And there are a lot of people.
You can't repeal parts of this,
The president has said 40 votes against it. Let's move on. What do you say, Lenny?
I would like to see the Congress not go back and try to repeal the whole thing en masse. I think there's something to be said about making sure people with pre-existing conditions are covered. But at the same exact time, we're already seeing that this bill is failing because of its own bureaucracy, and we're already seeing this bill fail because of the self-repeal from the administration. So at some point in time, we should look at this law.
The many delays the president has implemented
the many unconstitutional delays that he puts into place without the congressional authorization.
He says.
And pick and choose winners and losers, and this is something this president has been accused of previously. He picks winners and losers with his own landmark legislation. It's time to look at this as a law, take out what's not working right now, keep some of the things that people need in place, such as protecting those with pre-existing conditions, but go back to making sure that affordability and accessibility are there the way healthcare reform was intended to be in 2009.
Okay, but see, this is right. This is the same old stuff, Lenny, and all due respect. If you say allow people with pre-existing illnesses to sign up for medical care, that's a very expensive component. Somebody has a disease that's being treated and they want to shift the policy. So you have to have healthy people involved. Actually, during the 2008 primary, Obama and Clinton had debates about whether there should be a mandate, and all sorts of experts in the area said you have to have some type of mandate, otherwise people won't be insured until they're sick, and then they join insurance.
And President Obama was on the side of saying, how are you going to mandate people to do this?
That's right, he did.
And now he is finding out exactly what he reversed.
No, well, it didn't reverse.
People were not necessarily going to jump.
He listened to he realized that that was a necessary component. So all I'm saying is, it's easy to say these are the good things we like. We like pre-existing. We like the kids can stay in the plan. But you can't cherry pick because.
But practically, it's not working.
All right,
well, we haven't started. We're just starting it. Let's see where it goes.
Let's go to the phones. Fred, hello. What's your question or comment?
My comment is it's kind of hard to...
You don't think that's going to happen, do you?
No, and the numbers just don't show. We're supposed to be getting 39,000 a day registered. 39,000 a day registered to make their goal, and they're not doing it.
You don't think it's going to happen?
What are they, about halfway? They're about 3.5 million.
They're down 3.5 million.
Yeah, and they might not. Yeah,
on their own. This is their own goal.
And yeah, and it is a complicated. There's like backups in terms of risk corridors, which they call for. It gets very complicated, but I think it's going to go. I don't think there's. It's hard to imagine. You know, you can't just repeal it like the Congress is trying to do, because you're kind of left with nothing then. And there are a lot of people.
You can't repeal parts of this,
The president has said 40 votes against it. Let's move on. What do you say, Lenny?
I would like to see the Congress not go back and try to repeal the whole thing en masse. I think there's something to be said about making sure people with pre-existing conditions are covered. But at the same exact time, we're already seeing that this bill is failing because of its own bureaucracy, and we're already seeing this bill fail because of the self-repeal from the administration. So at some point in time, we should look at this law.
The many delays the president has implemented
the many unconstitutional delays that he puts into place without the congressional authorization.
He says.
And pick and choose winners and losers, and this is something this president has been accused of previously. He picks winners and losers with his own landmark legislation. It's time to look at this as a law, take out what's not working right now, keep some of the things that people need in place, such as protecting those with pre-existing conditions, but go back to making sure that affordability and accessibility are there the way healthcare reform was intended to be in 2009.
Okay, but see, this is right. This is the same old stuff, Lenny, and all due respect. If you say allow people with pre-existing illnesses to sign up for medical care, that's a very expensive component. Somebody has a disease that's being treated and they want to shift the policy. So you have to have healthy people involved. Actually, during the 2008 primary, Obama and Clinton had debates about whether there should be a mandate, and all sorts of experts in the area said you have to have some type of mandate, otherwise people won't be insured until they're sick, and then they join insurance.
And President Obama was on the side of saying, how are you going to mandate people to do this?
That's right, he did.
And now he is finding out exactly what he reversed.
No, well, it didn't reverse.
People were not necessarily going to jump.
He listened to he realized that that was a necessary component. So all I'm saying is, it's easy to say these are the good things we like. We like pre-existing. We like the kids can stay in the plan. But you can't cherry pick because.
But practically, it's not working.
All right,
well, we haven't started. We're just starting it. Let's see where it goes.
Let's go to the phones. Fred, hello. What's your question or comment?
My comment is it's kind of hard to work across the table or work with people that at the beginning, before you do anything, this group of people say, we have to oppose everything, like the other gentleman said, that we need to be united against anything. And didn't even have Republicans, our Republicans of Pennsylvania, come out to say, I can't believe they're voting against their own bill. because they don't want to give him a win.
So you think the Republicans are opposing anything that the president presents, and that they don't have any good reasons, as have been cited by Mr. McAllister here, for changing things?
Well, that's exactly it. That was their strategy, is for them to win the White House again, which is old news. For them to win the White House again.
So if they just keep saying no, no, no to the president's agenda, they'll win the White House and the Senate too. Is that it?
I missed your question.
If they keep saying no, no, no to anything the president opposes, sooner or later they'll win the White House and the Senate too. You think that's the plan?
Right. That was the plan at the beginning. But then when that plan failed and he got reelected, they're still sitting there looking at each other like, okay, now what are we going to do? He got back in there again.
Lenny?
If I may, I think two things have changed since fall 2013, which should bring about some bipartisan working together, if you will. Number one, the president lost credibility because as soon as the statement of, if you like your plan, you can keep your plan, was proven to be hollow, he has now had to take a step back. His approval rating has taken a permanent hit with that. But just the same, you finally saw Speaker Boehner stand up to the more extreme parts of the Republican Party and say, listen, enough is enough. When you have those two things in place now going through 2014, and you have key senators, particularly Republicans, that can win states that went blue the last time their senatorial run came around, they will be more inclined to work with this president on common sense solutions.
Unless they get primaried. Is that correct, Bill?
Yeah, and I
By
think
the Tea Party.
And I think that that's a possibility, but less than it was 2 years ago, because the shutdown was a terrible black eye by the Republicans. That was a terrible mistake, and they paid for it. And I think John Boehner has been doing just what Lenny has said. He's been sitting with these members saying, "We're not going to do this again. We're not going to go through this again," and they've been saying it to Ted Cruz in the Senate as well. Because we don't want to primary our people, like Bill Schuster's being primaried, for God's sakes. There's no reason for that in our state, for example, and we don't want to lose members, and because we're shooting ourselves and creating our own chaos.
Can the Republicans take the Senate?
Oh, yeah.
I think that's the odds are pretty good. The Democrats have to defend 22 and the Republicans 9. So I think the odds are.
We were saying earlier, I think it's a natural outgrowth of the fact that in 2008 Obama swept a lot of states that maybe were purple states, if you will, and those are the seats that are up now. All
right, we have to take this break. Our number is 412-333-PCNC. We'll continue to take your calls next. Stay with us. Let's go right back to the phones. Wayne, hello. What's your question or comment?
Hello, Chris. My comment was listening to the Obama conversation, and I can't understand how he lives in a different world than us, because on Social Security we only got like a 1.2 on cost of living raise, and with water and being raised and everything, we're not, in the next 3-4 years, we're going to, 1.2 is not even going to be able to flush a toilet.
You're talking about retirement benefits and increases in the cost of living and that sort of thing, right?
Right.
Okay, Clifford, what do you say?
Well, number one, for the cost of living is COLA, so it was related to the fact that there was a low inflation. So that's really set by some sort of formula.
And not the president.
As for that's not the president. As for the water rates are going up because of the various consent orders that local governments are signing because the raw sewage is going into the rivers, and that's driving a lot of the local infrastructure costs. So then the next question is there federal money to help and assist the local governments with infrastructure? And that's the sort of discretionary income that's being cut now over the last few years.
Wayne, do you feel like the president did not address the concerns of retirees?
Well, my opinion is that there's a lot of people on Social Security that really, if they listen to his speech, they'd think, boy, we're really doing good. And for that 1.2 that they're getting, they're really not getting nothing. And I had this opinion that he gave a good speech, but I had an opinion that everybody was doing a lot better, and I don't think that's a real-world thing. That's my opinion.
Well, let me just say, the one thing I would say is, if you're looking at sort of the political dichotomy here, I think the president has advocated keeping Social Security basically as an intact program, and a lot from the right and more conservatives want to have the individual accounts and basically have people individually invest their funds. So I think that would be a dismantling of Social Security as we know it.
Social
He never
Security.
mentioned
I'm sorry,
Social Security. He never mentioned Social Security once last night. And he'll never, not one
I
word.
think that's Wayne's point. His concerns weren't addressed.
Why wasn't there something like that? And it took him 3/4 of that speech to get to international foreign affairs too. So I thought the priorities were kind of followed up. I expected him to say something conciliatory on Social Security, and it's guaranteed, and there's not going to be any problem. But they didn't even spend a sentence on it.
No, I understand that, but the issue in Social Security would be, do you keep Social Security as it is? I don't think it would be tough to advocate for a increase, say, in payments in Social Security, given all the battles with the debt and deficit and all that. So I think the political issue on the table would be, do you alter Social Security as we know it and turn it in the form of individual accounts, as some of the
Well, we tried that in 2005 and it didn't go anywhere.
I don't think anybody wants to go back
well,
to
and I guess the answer is this really isn't in play as an issue right now, which is probably why it wasn't mentioned yesterday.
Wayne, you just feel like you were left out. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for your call.
Thank you, Chris.
All right, let's talk about international affairs. The president did say he would stand fast with Israel. He said that we needed to verify anything that has to go with Iran and the bomb. Do you think, Bill, that was strong enough language, or they need to be tougher with sanctions?
My Nobel Prize has not been dusted off for a while, so it's hard for me to...
Neither has the president's.
Well,
your point is well taken.
He got his sooner than mine. I got mine. The problem is that this thing with Iran, I just don't think they've sold it well enough. Because people are highly skeptical, particularly Congress. There's 77 signaries in the House and 56 signaries in the Senate for stronger sanctions. So they're not even buying what the White House is saying. And the problem is that they believe that...
But the president says there's a role for diplomacy here.
Yeah, I know he does. But the problem is that the Iranian uranium that they're trying to reverse is a reversible factor. So if they back off and decide we're not going to continue these negotiations, they can reverse whatever they've done to get rid of that nuclear development. So that's the question mark that Congress has right now. And the president, I just don't. I really think there's more of a communication problem there than a political problem. I just don't think he sold it.
And further, you have the Americans coming to the table saying we want those centrifuges destroyed. And just as recently as Sunday, you had the Iranian president going on CNN saying we are not going to destroy those centrifuges. Therefore, you start having very fundamental differences.
He did say we're not going to refine it past 5%, and it takes 20% of refining it to build the bomb.
I mean, we can talk about what people say, and then you talk about what they are or are not going to do. Germany was rebuilding their economy. They weren't preparing for a war, and we saw what ended up happening to Europe over the course of the end of the 1930s, too. So this is the concern that many people in Congress have.
Yeah.
They're telling me we need a break, so we'll take a break, and Clifford will come back and let you respond. Stay with us. All right, Clifford, we promised you could respond. Go ahead.
Well, again, sometimes you have to deal with the world as it is, not as we wish it could be. And we've just had 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, so I don't know that there's a stomach to go in and invade Iran, number one. Number two, it's interesting,
There certainly was no stomach to go invade Syria.
Well, right. Well, but again, I don't know where that would have gotten us. And there's sort of limits to what we can do, and are we willing to be there for a decade. But I think one of the really telling things is that Iran has multiple political facets going on in their country. So it's really telling that it's the conservative group in Iran that is strongly opposed to the negotiations taking place. And this president is considered to be more of a moderate. And so, I agree that we don't really know where all this is going to go, but let's give diplomacy a chance, I think is fair, and let's help what is
in this world
moderate.
that we talk about, can we all just sing Kumbaya and get along, though? I mean, it's a dangerous world.
Well, it's a dangerous world, but if the choice is to go in and invade, I mean, you got to understand the limitations about what we're willing to do.
What about sanctions?
Well, sanctions have been working and drove us to a point where there are these negotiations now, and the idea of the negotiations was it's a 6-month period. Let's see what we can do. There's a trust-building element. So I agree. I think they're all looking at it, and I think everybody understands what the objectives are, But we've got a foot in the door, and let's.
But we got
a minute to respond to you two.
We have to make sure that we're staying on top of this throughout 2014. The concern is we broker some type of deal with Iran in the early part of 2014, then we get caught up in domestic affairs as we approach this midterm election, and then by the time we get to 2015, we find out that Iran's further along, Israel's highly upset with us, and then we have to go right back to this all over again. So we have to stay on top.
We will be Israel's friend always.
No, and I think we agree. I think you have to monitor that and look at that. I think to jump in right now, you're in the process of talks. There has been baby steps that have been taken. So to have sanctions right at this moment is maybe ill-advised.
Billy, you got the first word, you get the last word.
We saw what happened in '67 in Israel. We saw what happened in '73 in Israel. This is a constant state of strife. I don't think for eternity we're ever going to see the resolve of it. And
Israel won both of those, by the way.
Israel did win both of those, but against heavy odds.
But in negotiations paid off with Egypt. So
finally.
Well,
finally,
they
but
do
it
pay
took
off
a war to do it.
Right.
And the president said one thing last night, let's get off a war setting as far as the country goes. I thought that was an interesting comment.
All right. Well, that's going to wrap it up for us. We'll come back with one more thought in just a second. I'm Chris Moore. I want to thank all of you for being here. Bill, Lenny, and Clifford, thank you very much. An interesting show. I'm Chris Moore, back with one more thought in just a second.